started? I guess we're going to get started. Okay, so good morning, welcome, thank you for coming to this session. It's called Philosophical Perspectives. My name is Corey Anton, I'm from Grand Valley State University. To my immediate right is Matthew Siegel from the California Institute of Integral Studies, and to his right is Ronan Hallowell from the USC Rossier School of Education. And we're missing our fourth panelist, so we're going to try to keep it under 20 minutes each, and we're going to leave time for people to talk and raise questions and whatnot. So, and I would also, please mark your calendar right now. Attend the business meeting that is going on Saturday at 1:30. We need to have people attend and get involved in the MEA. So, I will start and I'll have the panelists introduce their papers and sort of proceed as we go along. The title of my paper. Glad?
I'm glad.
Oh, glad. Very good. Our fourth panelist. Yeah, we'll have 15 minutes each, and they're going to keep time in the back here. Okay.
You should have started it.
Yeah, we're starting. Okay. So my paper is called Alphabetic Print-Based Literacy, Hermeneutic Sociality, and Philosophic Culture, and I guess I'll say a little bit about how the paper came into existence and some background on it. There's no way that I can cover all the things that are going on in here. I was asked to guest edit a issue of the Review of Communication by Eric Ramsey, and it turned into a double issue, but it was precipitated from an MEA session at NCA where he had asked if it would be possible to try to talk about what media ecology has to say to philosophy. Like, is media ecology relevant to philosophy? How do they respond to philosophical problems and philosophical issues? And I thought it was very important, and I put out the call, and so my paper is largely looking at the role that literacy plays in making Western philosophy possible. And by that, I'm talking not only about the alphabet and the way that the alphabet did certain shifts from the oral world and the oral orientation, and then on to manuscript and some of the important differences between manuscript culture and print culture. I think one way to phrase it is that I'm not really interested in reading and writing as acts. I'm interested in literacy as a condition, and the way that once we've become literate, our ways of thinking, our ways of interacting, the assumptions that we have about what discourse is and how it's to proceed seems to be highly affected and somewhat changed. And this will hopefully set up my next two panelists, but the quotation I begin with the paper is from Ong, and he says, this is the quotation, he says, "In his modes of thought, Whitehead has made the point that we habitually mingle speech and writing so much that when we discuss language, we hardly know whether we refer to oral performance or the written work or both." He says, the situation is in fact much worse than Whitehead suggests. And that it's much more, I think, nuanced and complex, the different relationships between the spoken word and written word and how they get subsequently entangled into each other. So, as I said, I'm going to do just a tiny little bit of reading the opening of this, and maybe a little bit on the end, and I'm going to try to then piece all the things together. And some of this, well, maybe I'll just talk it through. When I'm writing papers, sometimes I will get my favorite chair, and I close my eyes, and I'm sort of thinking through the paper, and I'm asking myself, what do I want to say? What's the best way to come at it? I'm rehearsing different ways of orienting toward the piece. And if I ask a question like, to what extent is that silent, directed speech, consciously entertained, a symptom or an outcome or a practice of literacy, it just seems loaded with ambiguities. And there's, like, what do you mean that this is, how could this possibly be literacy? There's no pen, there's no paper, there's just me with my eyes closed thinking. And it sounds almost heavy-handed to say that this is a literate act. And yet the more I think we think about it, it's hard to disentangle what kind of thought we experience now that we are literate versus the kinds of thoughts that were entertained by the oral mind. That is, extended silent self-expression as it unfolds as searching for possible ways of writing things down, it naturally precipitates into text. Literates sense that they can write any thought down and any expression that comes to them. So privately entertaining possible expressions for future context, meticulously scrutinizing the precise wording of one's thoughts, maintaining some degree of skepticism regarding the transparency of expression. All of these are part of literate sensibilities. That is, a different way to say it is, right, that literate thought, moving in the context of expressions that are or can be written down, they must meet the demands of decontextualization, anonymity, dictionary definitions, and reader skepticism. That means that novel expressions that an unknown audience could find intelligible can have a great deal of individual conscious deliberation behind them. And so I think that the point here would be, if I say, to what extent would Western philosophy have been possible without literacy, the obvious answer is it wouldn't have been possible at all. And especially if we say, well, philosophy is becoming familiar with a canon of texts, it's studying those texts, and then it's writing academic papers and academic journals and whatnot. But I think if you say it's a much more subtle thing, is it just philosophical thinking itself, a kind of wonder, a kind of skepticism, a willingness to entertain novelty, a lessening of the fear of forgetfulness? I'm going to suggest all of those things are necessary for philosophical thought, and they were necessary, or they were a necessity that sort of that was accommodated for by literacy, and particular alphabetic text, and then what happened as manuscripts became printed. So I think to maybe clarify the difference between what we'll call oral noetics versus literate noetics, I think some characteristics, and a lot of the part on the oral world is drawing off of Eric Havelock and David Abram, in particular David Abram's book Spell the Sensuous and Havelock's his preface to Plato. And I think the oral world is caught in some way in a mimetic reenactment. It's the noetic economy is constrained by rhyme, repetition, meter, alliteration, whereas the kind of, call it syntactical gymnastics that are open to the literate, they're able to tolerate very odd or novel expressions because you're not fearful that it's going to contaminate the already accumulated knowledge. And so as literacy is setting in, and this is where you get the Socrates, Plato, Aristotle development, right? That Socrates is there, and although he doesn't write anything down, he becomes this, I guess, representative of a different way of talking. That is a way of questioning mimetic culture, of questioning the reliance upon cliche-like formula. And, some of this has to do with the detribalization that alphabetic text introduces. It's an economic system of very limited number of signs and symbols that enables it to be learned in a single generation, and it's highly specialist. The real, and I know many people in here are already familiar with this, but I think the important, significant break that happened with the alphabet was a break with consonantal or syllabic script, where consonantal or syllabic script, the smallest unit, is available to the ear and it's the syllable. But as soon as you get to the alphabet, you're able to tear asunder what the ear can only hear as a unit. That is, you're able to hear the pure consonant. So take the names of the letters of our initial alphabet letters, right? So we have A, and then you have B, C, D, and E. Those are the names of the letters of those in our alphabet. But when you think about it, the B and the C and the D, they all have the E sound. But when you write it out in the consonant, you can see the part that is visible but not auditorily available to us. And I think for McLuhan, for I guess a lot of folks in media ecology, this is where the spell gets broken. This is where the spell of the sensuous sort of, it releases people from a kind of installment in their environment and allows for increasing amounts of entertaining, very, very abstract kinds of relations. Now, by the time you get to, then Plato starts to write dialogues, and I always feel obligated to say this, that Plato it's a word in Greek that roughly means broad or buff, something like this, like an athletic term. It's not a name of a person, right? We know it historically as Plato. I think his actual name was Aristocles, but he's part of a tradition, and this goes all the way up to Socrates. It goes all the way up, I guess, to Aristotle, where if Socrates, again, writes nothing, Plato writes in dialogues that are resembling still some of the oral and acoustic noetics. By the time you get to Aristotle, you're getting to full-on logic that's only possible with writing. Simple example, take A is greater than B and B is greater than C. That means that A is greater than C. But notice, A, that we're right now using abstract letters to think about relations of non-empirical realities, but also that we're using alphabetic letters as the designators for those. That is, the alphabet introduces a systematic way of thinking about relations disentangled from all their empirical particulars. Right? So it's very abstract in its nature. Now McLuhan talks a lot about this, what he calls detachment, or the ability to act without reacting. And I think a lot of the work that I'm trying to do in the paper it's coming up with Jack Goody's stuff, but it's to talk about embodied cognition. And I think that you don't necessarily have to claim that it's a radical transformation of consciousness as much as claim that it's a different condition of the kinds of communication that are possible, and that the materiality of those different communication media are what we need to attend to. And so again, it doesn't have to be that consciousness, as if it's some sort of inside thing, gets transformed. Instead, we can talk about, consciousness is embodied, and the way it's embodied can change. And I thought a really clear, simple example of this was when the Flint water crisis was happening in Michigan. I watched a woman give a testimony, and she was obviously very upset over what had happened there. And she, in advance, she prepared, I think we all would, she prepared a statement. And she read from that, and she was well aware that she only, she was well aware that she would react to her own speech too spontaneously, and she would lose her composure. So again, she was able to get a hold of her emotions, act with a kind of detachment through text. And I think text is where we get something like a conscious control over our emotions, at least momentarily, as we can get strategic about it. I think I'm obviously running out of time here. I have no idea this is going to go this quickly. I think the thing I would say about the crucial point about the difference between manuscript culture and print culture is that print gives identical copies, and without the identical copy, you really can't have an author. I mean, authors come into existence. Not only do authors come into existence with text trying to be promoted and advertising and this kind of stuff, but just think about it. That if you were to handwrite a manuscript, it's a single item. Now it could be copied, in a scriptorium, something like this, but there's going to be little differences. There's all these anomalies, changes in handwriting, size, and you don't have, in manuscript culture, you don't have headings. Reading is generally reading aloud of one person to many, but the practice of an individual slowly learning by reading rather than learning to read. See, I think this is Elizabeth Eisenstein makes this very important distinction of the difference between learning to read and learning by reading. That print really makes possible learning by reading, and it facilitates something like philosophic culture. Maybe one way to just wrap it up would be, I think probably one of the bigger anachronisms is the word Library of Alexandria. Was there a great center for learning in the ancient world? Yes. And did it have manuscripts that people were able to go and to engage and learn from? Yes. But it wasn't anything like what we think of as a library. Right? It didn't have card catalogs. There were no indices. No one went, shh, I'm reading you. There was a public engagement and a sort of collective studying, and the notion of the itinerant scholar in the medieval period, right? You'd have to go to a particular place, monastery, scriptorium, get a particular manuscript, study it as closely as you could, and then you would have to go to a different place, try to find a similar manuscript, try to compare. It's so different than the actual comparison of identical texts that we can do hermeneutically, right, with today's print. Maybe I'll give last example here would be, try to think about you writing an essay exam for your students. When you print it out, you print out identical copies for all your students to look at. If you had to handwrite out all of the exams, think of how much irregularity or difference there'd be in all the exams you hand out to students. Now, when you print them out and you hand them to students, they all have the identical exams. But when the students write in theirs, now you're getting something more resembling manuscript culture, where you have to slow down, it's more irregular. Sometimes if I give the exams back to students, the students can struggle to read their own handwriting. It sort of shows you the difference between the speed of a hot print, like printed text, and a comparatively cooler text that are found in manuscripts. The moral of the story is philosophy as we know it today would be utterly impossible without alphabetic print. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Corey. Very sympathetic to the idea that the alphabet, and perhaps print itself, is sort of the media a priori for philosophy. I'm going to read the first part of this paper. I only found out we get 15 minutes last week, and I already had a 4,500 word paper. So I'm going to use the medium of writing to try to get at the cosmos with a little help from Alfred North Whitehead. So I think that Whitehead's organic cosmology can help us expand.
Can you speak up just a little bit?
Oh, sure. I think Whitehead's organic cosmology can help us expand the scope of media ecology beyond its ordinarily, or at least traditionally, humanistic focus. Neil Postman defined media ecology as the critical study of how media technologies envelope and form cultures. As Marshall McLuhan famously put it, man is an extension of nature that remakes the nature that makes the man. This definition of media ecology is premised on the idea that human beings have a foot in two different worlds, a natural or physical environment that includes our own living bodies, and a media environment that extends our embodied expressions into a non-material or quasi-material space of meaning. Each form of communication technology, whether it's speech, the alphabet, the printing press, radio, TV, the internet, etc., creates a surrogate nature, an artificial environment within which new cultures grow, sometimes deformed due to their alienation from and lack of resonance with original nature. Today, largely because of a lack of resonance, we find ourselves the late capitalist denizens of a planet in crisis. Geologists and Gaian physiologists tell us that we have entered the Anthropocene. Technological civilization, in its rush to establish a new and improved second nature on top of the first, has neglected to consider that first nature, the Earth, is not a mere stockpile of raw material waiting to fuel the growth and innovation of the human economy, but a complex and highly differentiated eco-poetic superorganism. Ecopoiesis is a word that Lovelock has used and that Evan Thompson has carried forward to get at the difference between Gaia as an organism and other organisms that could be described as autopoetic. So the planetary ecological crisis has made the modern theory of the so-called bifurcated nature obsolete. And the bifurcation of nature I'll get into in a second. This is a term coming out of Whitehead. Cultural productions and physical processes, perhaps once separable in thought, are now irrevocably entangled at a geochemical level. Our ability to understand and respond to the planetary ecological crisis may be aided by a truly ecological media ecology, by the idea, that is, that there is not just an analogical resonance between natural ecologies and media ecologies, but a cosmological community. Whitehead's organic cosmology allows us to generalize media ecology's focus on the medium instead of the message, such that the world itself is brought into view as a medium of communication. Perhaps such an imaginative generalization of media ecology into an ecological metaphysics, or a metaphysics of the medium, if you will, can help sensitize us to the primal logos of the cosmos. Now, this work is already well underway, carried forward by theorists including, not sure how to pronounce his first name, UC Parika, John D. Peters, Mark Hansen, Adam Robert, who's with us in the audience here, and Andrew Murphy. They each, especially the last three, turn to Whitehead's process relational metaphysics in search of a more cosmological media ecology. Recognizing that humans represent only one of the cosmos' many forms of communicative being, and that the storage, transmission, and transformation of meaning occurs at every scale, from the quantum to the geological to the galactic, opens up new theoretical perspectives on and practical interventions into the study of media. In alignment with this conference's theme, becoming conscious of a communicative cosmos has profound technological, ecological, and theological implications. So, as I said, I'm going to read part 1 here. Part 2 engages more specifically with Mark Hansen's recent book, Feed Forward. So hopefully I'll have this paper published at some later time if you're interested in that part. McLuhan and Postman theorized media largely from an anthropocentric perspective. In other words, media are extensions of man, extensions of the human. There's much to be learned from such a perspective, certainly, but it is not the only perspective from which to study media. Unlike Postman, with his prophet-like criticisms of new media's deleterious effects on contemporary culture, McLuhan's Catholic faith sometimes led him to offer a more theologically charged take on electronic media. He went so far as to suggest that what we now call the internet may be the technological incarnation of the mystical body of Christ. Of course, he also worried that electronic media were just Satan's latest temptation. God has an important role to play in Whitehead's media theory as well, though less as a subject of religious worship than as a metaphysical principle providing the coherence to his cosmological scheme. For Whitehead, God is that infinite actuality which introduces an ideal harmony or an aesthetic order into the world, making cosmos out of chaos by providing what Whitehead calls the initial aim or the erotic lure conditioning every finite creative act. In Whitehead's words, God is the mirror which discloses to every creature its own greatness. Whitehead's is an aesthetic theory of being, wherein God is the poet of the world, rather than the sort of coercive dictator, reigning from on high. God is the poet of the world. McLuhan said of all media prior to electronic technologies that they were extensions or prostheses of the human being. But with the emergence of digital media and the internet, an uncanny reversal seems to be occurring. The human is becoming an extension of media. According to McLuhan, we ourselves are being translated into information, as he said in Understanding Media. Digital media have been characterized as environmental, elemental, as atmospheric, right, the cloud, because they surround and dissolve our classical conceptions of human agency. Data is now the most powerful weapon in the world, as the governments, corporations, and anonymous hackers who wield it have the ability to shape our collective perceptions and actions, even while we continue to believe that we are individuals thinking for ourselves. The situation is decidedly double-edged. We have instantaneous access to more information about each other and the world than ever before in human history. But this information also has access to us. Whether we call it the informational revolution, the Technozoic era, or the Anthropocene, it is clear that our species has become a planetary force on par with supervolcanoes and meteorites. Just as this realization begins to dawn on us, media theorists are articulating, in Mark Hansen's words, a non-anthropocentric, non-prosthetic, and radically environmental theory of media. Hansen, Murphy, and others turn to Whitehead's panpsychism in order to reimagine the ontology of media as part of an effort to overcome the modern bifurcation of nature. Now, the bifurcated theory of nature has it that nature is a soundless, scentless, colorless affair, with all experience and interpretation, all emotion and purpose, all value and agency reserved for the human, or at most the animal, and maybe for some for God. Media theory has tended to treat perception as though it existed in an ontologically unique domain outside and above mere material existence. Humans and their technologies do the mediating, while nature itself remains passively mediated. In protest against the bifurcation of nature, Whitehead articulated a radical account of perception, whereby the affective inheritance of our own just past bodily experience becomes analogous to all of nature's causal transactions. Human temporality, even if stretched and intricately folded, is still continuous with cosmic temporality. For Whitehead, the ultimate concrete facts composing nature are non-conscious acts of perceptivity. To be actual for Whitehead is to be the achievement of a specific form of feeling, or what Whitehead refers to in his technical language as a prehension. Causal efficacy in nature is the transmission of an occasion of feeling from the settled past into the cresting wave of the present. Once an actual occasion's present form has reached completion, its perceptivity perishes, and it offers itself as an expression, feeding the emergence of subsequent prehensive actualities. Expression, says Whitehead, is the one fundamental sacrament, the outward and visible sign of an inward and spiritual grace. The recipient extends his apprehension of the ordered universe by penetrating into the inward nature of the originator of the expression. There is then, Whitehead continues, a community of intuition by reason of the sacrament of expression, proffered by one and received by the other. So when McLuhan described the miracle whereby, and I quote, "in ordinary perception we incarnate the exterior world," because human perception is literally incarnation, end quote. Whitehead goes further by arguing that, and I quote again, every event, not just humans, every event on its finer side introduces God into the world, such that the world lives by its incarnation of God in itself." That's from Whitehead's little book, Religion in the Making. Expression and prehension, then, are the systole and diastole movements of cosmic creativity, the call and response between God and the world. Every creature, whether atomic, galactic, biotic, or anthropic, is privy in various degrees to this conversation. McLuhan's theological intuitions already offer media ecology one way beyond its ordinarily anthropocentric charter. But by accepting some version of the bifurcation of nature, McLuhan falls short of the, in Hansen's terms, becoming cosmological of media that is achieved by Whitehead. Media theory's founding insight that the medium is the message must be translated into cosmology. 5 minutes. Adam Robert offers one translation in the form of what he calls a geological media ecology. In his words, organisms are media ecologists enveloped by the media ecologies of other organisms. The Earth itself is not a passive ground upon which events unfold, he continues, but a medium that constrains and conditions the energetic cascade of organismic and ecosystemic development. Along similar lines, Barica has suggested that the Earth as living creature communicates via the assembled resources it fashions and provides. Barica offers his own translation of the medium is the message into cosmology via what he calls a psychogeophysical inquiry into the memories of rocks, raising a dilemma anyone deep into Whitehead would find attractive. The question he asks is, how do the soil, the crust, the rocks, and the geological world sense? Such a question might seem odd at first, but this is an invitation to consider anew the ontological implications of the way natural sciences like geology and astronomy have taught us so much about the cosmos by treating it as a kind of recording medium. So I don't think I have time to fully read this section, but the media theorist John Durham Peters just wrote a book called The Marvelous Clouds, Towards an Elemental Theory of Media. And he goes into the way that the study of geology, of various geological strata of the Earth, and the study of the cosmos are both, in some sense, studying the universe as though it were a kind of recording medium. When astrophysicists look at the background radiation left over from the Big Bang, they're looking at the universe's recording of itself. And while the light that's reaching us from this vast distance seems to be distorted by gravity lensing and other sort of flaws in the recording medium, those flaws actually teach us something about the nature of the universe. So a warp in the medium is a source for knowledge of what the universe is like. So Whitehead's philosophy of organism allows a radical new possibility to become thinkable, that the world can be reimagined as a medium because the cosmos is itself composed of communicative processes at every scale. The world itself has always been, in Whitehead's terms, a medium for the transmission of influences. Cosmologizing media theory means finally, decisively letting go of the Cartesian or Kantian framework that extends mere matter forever beyond a meaning-intending mind. As Peters puts it, nature abounds in meaning, most of which we have no idea how to read or even acknowledge that it is there. We should understand intelligence at all scales as the dynamic, restless, inarticulate genius of life forms evolving in their environments, with human brain intelligence just one glorious outpost of organic evolution. So this is a scale-free conception of intelligence that requires a more general theory of communication, maybe even a more general semantics, than that which would suppose that the paradigm case of communication is one human mind trying to convey a thought to another. So with a truly, and not just metaphorically, ecologized media theory, we can come to see the pre-human world was already a medium for the transmission of data. Humans are not just now being transformed into information by digital media. Like the universe, we were always already made of self-interpreting information. But for Whitehead, a bit of information, or a datum, is a potential for feeling. And every potential seeks satisfaction through some actualization in an occasion of experience. So much remains to be unpacked. I'm sure there are questions, so I'll stop there and we can discuss this further.
I'm going to start off by responding a little bit to the previous presenters and sort of getting into my mind jazz here, more improvisational with less pre-prepared text. I'm not necessarily bragging about that, acknowledging the fact, but I think it will complement nicely with, I hope, what our previous presenters have talked about. First, responding to Corey a little bit, so Mike talks about media, ecological metaphysics, process, philosophy, spirituality, and ecological civilization. In addition to working at University of Southern California, do you know what? Sorry, just getting this.
No, it's an awesome image. Don't apologize.
We have this.
That's the power structure.
Is there airplay icon on? Is there airplay?
Sorry, we have this set up. So while she's setting up, let me just kind of keep going. Talking about responding to Corey a little, so media, ecological metaphysics, process, philosophy, spirituality, and ecological civilization. Corey mentioned the first quote here from Alfred North Whitehead: "The major advances in civilizations are processes that all but wreck the societies in which they occur," which was in the medium as the massage. And just responding with the development of literacy, one thing that McLuhan mentions in understanding media is how literacy increased the intensity of warfare, of being able to give orders at a distance. And so I think it's fair to say that warfare has wrecked many civilizations, continues to do so, and that there is some relationship in that shift. So in a sense, that shift in the mode of communication, a major, which in many ways is an advance of civilization in profound ways, but also in some ways has deleterious effects and has contributed to some of these problems that we have, as well as you mentioned, text being conscious control of our emotions. Now, in some ways, for certain modes of thought and ways of being, that can be useful. In others, it's extremely problematic. In coming to David Abrams' Spell of the Sensuous, he gets at how the development of alphabetic culture really began this intense distancing from this primordial logos that Matt mentioned, and talking about, following on Matt here, saying that a metaphysics of the medium could sensitize us to the primal logos of the cosmos. And so I'm very much in this project with Matt about the world as medium and cosmologizing media ecology, and really with the purpose of trying to consider our possibilities for survival. And this is where I can get into talking a little bit more about an application of Alfred North Whitehead's work in one of his not direct students, but a pretty second order person named John B. Cobb, who's at the Claremont School of Theology, 92-year-old theologian who studied with Charles Hartshorne, who was a philosophical theologian in Chicago, who was an assistant to Alfred North Whitehead at Harvard. And in this Whitehead studies has had some renaissance of late, but it kind of went somewhat dormant. It was preserved at this Center for Process Studies in Claremont, which I'm a research associate and had the privilege to work with John Cobb recently. And one of the key insights of Whiteheadian cosmology is the sense that we're not, so quoting Berry, but John Cobb likes Thomas Berry a lot, that the world is not a collection of objects, but a communion of subjects. And so really, the existence is made up of events in relationship, not discrete, irreducible substances. That's, I think, a really quick overview of Whitehead. And that John Cobb, in the 60s, he'd been working as a Whiteheadian theologian, and really Hartshorne had taken Whitehead in a more theological direction. Matt mentioned that Whitehead did talk about God, but really redefined the meaning of God. And I love this how he said God is bringing the infinite actuality that introduces ideal harmony and aesthetic order into the world. And so Whitehead recognizes that there are all these, what he calls actual occasions or actual entities of various forms of being, whether it's atoms or people or cells or whatever, that come together, and that can be lead to conflict or whatever. But the God principle, I think there's this creative impulse of trying to work out and harmonize that and overcome certain types of subject-object dualism that I think have a real relationship with the development of literacy and the development. I appreciate that Corey mentioned the development of Western philosophy. But I think it's important to know that philosophy did exist before literacy, and I mean it in the term of the word love of wisdom, which I often think that philosophy has really strayed from that basic meaning to where I call it the love of hair splitting. Which can be fun at times, but I don't think sufficient to the incredible challenge that we face. And in a Whiteheadian worldview, he ascribes value and some level of sentience throughout all of existence. So rocks and stars and plants. Now, he believes there's gradations in value and different ways of how they're configured, but that this is where not sort of some post-humanists have taken up Whitehead as a sort of his metaphysics that decenters human consciousness is like so exceptional. It's important, it's interesting, it's this intensive concrescency of this coming together of things, but it's not the only thing. And that so much in our development of literacy in this bifurcated nature, us getting out, outside of the primal logos, John Cobb and others will argue, and I think David Abram, that this is a sort of root metaphysical underlying cause of the environmental crisis. Now it gets wrapped up with all kinds of other things, and what John Cobb calls economism, the worship of economics and technology for itself, and rather than for this broader evolution of creativity. So in Whitehead, novel creativity is the ultimate principle of which God really emerges from, this underlying principle that values increased diversity and what he calls novelty. But not just, and this does open up what he talked about, there's a theodicy in Whitehead that opens up the possibility for evil, in this novelty, but also this is where I think that spirituality and wisdom traditions come in, and the best parts of human consciousness to help bring a harmonization and some ethics and morality potentially. This is what John Cobb has spent since the late 60s, recognizing that really the primary problem on the earth is the ecological crisis, and if humans are to, like he says, the earth will go on until the sun is destroyed or whatever, there's be some ultimate end to it, but kind of how do we deal with what we're doing? And so John Cobb has adapted Whiteheadian metaphysics as trying to bring like a kind of a philosophical remedy to kind of underlying problem of the Western world view that has gone out and dominated and raped and pillaged endlessly. And that it's not the only thing that's in some way tweaking and revamping that, and he believes that Whitehead's process relational framework helps do that. So here are 10 things that he's evolved out of this, and he'll oftentimes, in the work that he does around ecological civilization, which is an organization that emerged out of a large conference a couple years ago, it doesn't really necessarily go into Whitehead all that much. There's places where he'll go into Whitehead with Whiteheadians or other philosophy things, but his main is like, this should be used for the world, and I want to just hit on this fifth one, that about education is for wisdom, and we can't go through all of those things. So when I talk about spirituality, I think in term, which I know can be a vague and fuzzy term and mean different things to different people, but I think it's about having a sensitivity to the cosmos and a certain sort of empathy and acknowledgement of relationship. And that I'm an educator by trade, and so I'm going to focus a little bit on that. And that sort of, as we open to this, I think a cosmological perspective is, can be awe-inspiring. And I'm sort of following here at a beginning point, Abraham Joshua Heschel, saying that awe is the beginning of wisdom. So my thesis here is that if education is for wisdom, then we need to, what's the door to begin on the path towards wisdom, which is very challenging and maybe not easy to operationalize. But if we take Heschel at his word, and I'm thinking of awe as reverential respect mixed with wonder and fear produced by that which is sublime, grand, or extremely powerful, which I think should also instill a certain humility that I think is critical for an ecological civilization. And so this, I think education needs to work towards bringing us awe-inspiring experiences. And I think to do this, we really absolutely need imagination. And I know Matt talks a lot about this in his work and his dissertation and other things. This imagination for what is not but what could be. And we may never reach it, but can we think about the possibility of tapping our better angels? And I heard James Baldwin interview once, and he, incredible critic and very pessimistic in a lot of ways, and this was in the 60s. He said, at the end of the day, you can't tell the children there's no hope. And I see that a lot as a teacher. Sometimes I say, I'm a spoiler. I'm going to tell you how messed up the world is. And I think you have to do that. We have to have critical thinking, but we also need to have imagination for it. And this is very much fits in because imagination is an engine of novelty and creativity. And so I think it fits very well with the Whiteheadian perspective. I think the relevance to media ecology is that these media are the tools of creativity that we have, and they can be used for hegemony and domination, or they can be done for greater things, which I'm going to argue we should work towards what I call syntonic civilization. And the term syntony is used in psychiatry. Sometimes it means being responsive to and in harmony with the environment so that affect is appropriate to the given situation. And I'm going to connect affect with feeling. And this is something that I think literary culture has distanced us from feeling, the connection to the primal logos. and that we have a syntony deficit disorder in our world today. Both it's like an individual term, but I'm broadening it out to also a social term and ultimately civilization. And I would argue that we need to work to that because we are seriously dystonic at this point. And to work on that, I'm arguing that we seek to develop what I call a cosmological amatology. Amatology is a term that comes from this sociologist named Pitram Sorokin, who was the founder of the Harvard Sociology Department, mostly forgotten. He probably was a media ecologist, but somehow I'm sure I could bend his word into media ecology. The art and science of developing friendship, mutual aid, and love. I added with all our relations. He didn't talk about cosmological, I'm broadening it out to a cosmological amatology is a spiritual process. And I think undergirded with the Whiteheadian metaphysics and facilitated with an organic media ecology could help us find some really useful ways to move forward. I'm going to do here another neologism that I came up with. In Whitehead, he has a term called concrescence, which is the process of how disparate strands, the coming together of disparate strands into a nexus. And this is going from like the potential into the actual. And he's on these various levels of being. I think hospitable concrescence, a generous reception of strangers or the other. And I think we really need to find, I think another way to think of it is a type of symbiosis, where that merging leads to mutual survival rather than, like, say, a parasitic relationship where the parasite kills the host and then ultimately dies itself. So I think developing some cosmological amatology and hospitable concrescence with a goal of ecological civilization and tapping our better angels. And I'm going to leave you with, as challenging as things are and dire, and I think, at least in our realm, in some other cosmos, who care, whatever, we're flipping it. But I think for humans, we're feeling beings and we're connected with other feeling beings and we're creating a huge amount of suffering. And as crazy as it is, that if maybe some way we can see this as an opportunity and maybe change this quote to let that which wounds us be our cure. Thank you.
So our last speaker there is Planet Pantic
Yeah.
from Summit Region.
Whenever I woke up in the morning, I would like to change my name or do something about that because it appears that when my parents gave me the name, it immediately limits me in a certain way. Then they say I have to be responsive to my cultural roots and all that stuff, and then I kind of breaking between the two. Will I maintain the appearance of my culture, or anything what is I am conditioned about, or why when I wake up I call myself a name of the flower or something, whatever, it just comes to my consciousness, my feeling, gut, and I call myself as I feel. Heidegger would say that one of the major characteristics of the Dasein, we could call a human being in a sense, is a mood, attunement to the situation. And we don't live that. And I'm appalled as well, not appalled because I live. He called this time that we are all confined in vulgar time. It's a vulgar time, and we all struggle here within this 15 minutes thing. And we concede to it. And those brilliant things are coming within that 15 minutes, struggling and trying to break that. And we talk about that confinement, but also we are maintaining it. The reason why I'm starting this is I remember Thomas yesterday was recalling Owen saying poet starts from the middle, and then goes, I guess I'm a poet in a sense. And I will believe you guys as well coming up with all these beautiful concerns. Heidegger talks about concerns. Why concerns? He says that fundamentally, human beings, or let's say, I call it human beings, which we are already, but there is that failure. Although he never uses those kind of words, but I will be judgmental here. That we are taken away, falling a prey to everydayness, including us today here. And we are losing ourselves. It comes up to varieties of worlds and tangled everydayness, lostness in day. We get lost in day. So something is, I call that thinning from who we are really. Thinning, meaning getting by, and falling prey to day, everydayness, we lose the connection with what who we are really. Sorry, Ronan, you recall Peter's, you recall Peter's, and that's kind of relationship. He doesn't talk about the human being there, of course. He's talking about everything else, like everything else around it. But we are within it, and we have that connection with it. Heidegger, basically, although he talks, his major idea is to talk about the everydayness of the words, and he is like a post-concrete. Again, he never puts any value judgment, because it's almost it's necessary for us to become part of day, to be taken away, again, to be tempted to get lost, to forget, because this is the words that he uses, to be tranquilized, alienated, to get self-entangled, to get estranged from who we are. We plunge ourselves into day, into the world itself. We get dispersed. That is everything what is practically incorporated into most noise, amusing ourselves to that. We get so entangled in taking care about the things Heidegger said that we get to lose connection with who we are. So basically, all his masterpiece is talking, and the goal is to really put the light on what happens on the limited disclosures of the human being, which we are initially most of the time, functioning as a public figures, public, we call that publicness. Publicness. It's funny to think as well, because we talk about democracy now a little bit lower, but democracy is all about being public. But then what happens? Look at it. Democratic mass media, it has all this stuff, and we are polluted. There's a lot of abundance of information and all that stuff. You're suppressing me over there.
And doing a wonderful job at it.
No, sorry, that it's not. I love you very much. So we get into that sort of machine. Everybody, all of these brilliant, including you guys, brilliant McLuhan, was actually hovering somewhere else. Yesterday, I was told that Callie, Dennis, as well, with Thomas was yesterday talking about sacramental view of McLuhan, Ong, and Carey. Oh yeah, definitely. They were talking, the interesting thing about these intellectuals, brilliant, is because they are hovering within and never really speak. There is that kind of ambivalence of being clear about what and they are all using words like miracles, like Curry miracle. It's like something astonishing. Let me see what somewhere over there I actually pulled out from Curry is talking in his brilliant piece, whatever. But it's all around a miracle. miracles. And he finishes, Curry is finishing his piece about culture, communication and culture, saying, let me just try to, Curry, and this is just a part, his seminal publication as Culture James Curry calls a current obsessing commitment to transmission view of communication and the derivative representation of communication models of power and exciting. Okay, that's not what I wanted to say. Actually, working on a project of recasting our studies of communication. This is the last sentence. Recasting our studies of communication in terms of ritual model in two ways. More firmly grasping, that's about understanding. I have a problem with education because education might have to be everything about knowledge. But Heidegger is talking about understanding, and understanding has a different component. It's related to consciousness. And consciousness is the gate, it's a clearing, it's an openness, and which some people wind up to call different names. Cosmos, God, variety of things. I went today to the church over there, I walked in, it's a silence itself. Cosmos, silence, okay. And there is that awe. I came also to mention that awe, presence of awe. When I came with my wife from Vancouver, driving to Oregon coast, we spent 4 days watching Canada. Yeah, it was an awe of that power, of the wave, mist, that raw thing, and you just, there's no words anymore. This is the primal communication. Awe, that awe is the primal communication that I went to this church, and the church itself represents that. Nothing else. It represents human, I was just thinking about that, it represents a human attempt to preserve that, what we encounter outside. Over there, what my wife and I encountered by traveling through that. So like the church is some sort of attempt to preserve that people can go over there, walk in, and experience that something what is actually taken away from them. Being in the center of that energy and power and that primal communication. Oddly enough, at the half of his piece, Heidegger is actually calling, it's called that call of consciousness. That anxiousness that we feel within is a call of conscience. It's a call of that awe, it's called us back to come back from helplessness and constantly living day. And why we thought we said, okay, this distinguishes fear and anxiety. It says fear is, of course, something when we fear about something is external. We fear about animal, we fear about whatever, something what is external. But anxious, being anxious, is you and me. Being anxious is a call of consciousness. It's called to go back, to actually understand. And what is necessary for us in order to actually, he never says you shouldn't be part of that. She never says, oh no, yeah, we're going to the church and go out yourself and become a monk or something. He says in order really to live authentically, and he calls this other way in Dane publics this inauthentic. He says you know to understand your situation, simplistically saying. That requires grasping that carries us. Grasping, understanding, not the knowledge or something. Because knowledge, we pile out all sorts of knowledge and there is no soul within it. Because of no that primal understanding. Only primal understanding, only going to girls we actually deal with it. I was looking at that list as well of Hobbes lists, and I say, okay, I'm sorry I'm saying that, but that whole list is perception of being within day, thinking day, most of it. No. in order to change all this stuff, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we try to specify. It's only one thing. Be conscious. Go back to the source, to the prevalent. And then, when you are there, you can bounce back and be reconnect with they and bring that in. So on each heart has a goal to become conscious, to understand the call. That call of all in the church, and in silence. This is the problem, because that is silent. We don't live in silent world. This is what Boston is saying, it's clanking, clink, clank, clink, clank. It's constantly drive us away from hearing that song, that call, which is anxiety. We feel like usually as an anxiety, Heidegger says. As an anxiety, and we think we want to run away from it. And we're getting it more and more entangled today. So we distract, why we distract ourselves about this? Because we misunderstand that anxiety and I don't feel good. Well, we are supposed not to feel good. Okay? We are supposed not to go and see what is that. The call is that we are not authentic. That call is telling us you are, and what they actually basically, what the people basically do, they run away from it into more entertainment. Into today's kids with all these playing now, what they are seeking some control. But that's all understanding, because Heidegger says, well, you need to get into that in order really to realize that you have to take back and go back to really. So it's both. There is no saying that, oh yeah, we'll abandon all this dating, publicity, and run away. No, you have to follow back, and then you have to be resolute about it. This is this addition. You need to be, they call this resoluteness. Okay. You need, when you understand that there is you follow up the call. And this is why it's resoluteness, being resolute is extremely important, he says. Because it's a decision to follow the call of God, cosmos, primal communication, to develop that capacity, that sensitivity, because it's all about the senses, sensual thing. It's a primal thing. Well, of course, writing and literacy and is our extension. Everybody agreed that reading more. We kind of developed all this time to express ourselves, to expand ourselves. But then, unfortunately, we kind of got away from ourselves as well. So I would just finish with that. Just one sentence. It's major, therefore, Heidegger says, to really follow the call of consciousness in order to be authentic. And of course, then you are responsible to bring that authenticity back to the world. Back to the world. This is when the change is going to happen, which individually each of us do that business, and it's freaking hard. I guess that's why we don't have any success about that. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. We have lots of time for questions.
I have two quick comments for Matt. I'm usually a card-carrying member of the Media Ecology Association's Peanut Gallery and have plenty of wisecracks, but in this case, I was really struck by the elegance of the writing and the fact that there was some difficulty in the medium translating it from the time constraint in this oral environment. I thought you demonstrated some elegant thinking in addition to the text itself, in being able to adjust and adapt to, not getting to everything you probably wanted to get to. So this just me offering some flattery where I would normally be a wise guy. The second thing is sort of question comment-ish. The simple part of the question is I'm curious about whether or not you have a chance to interact with Gregory Bateson's work. It strikes me that some of the things that you were talking about through Whitehead are represented in Bateson, and it was, I think, even more familiar in the ecology circles the transition between the cybernetics and systems theory view of autopoiesis and to the ecopoiesis is really sort of the substance of ecology of mind. And the way that I think through him you tie, this sort of human life world to that thing, that bifurcated natural world, is the idea that our both our biology and our consciousness are built through this process of right? And we ascribe the intent to the conscious part of it and don't much think about how our biological evolution is also part of this differentiation that makes us like the rocks and the trees and the sky and the rest of it. And I think his writing is really elegant in that way. It allows you to see how, the reasons why we're biologically structured the way we are and how our consciousness emerges from that, and how in the end, he says, I think, Corey, maybe you can point to exactly where this is in Ecology of Mind, but the idea that in this space between, our discrete self and the environment around us, when we learn to sort of see how artificial that is, that's maybe what we mean by God, I think he says at one point. And it just strikes me that there's a lot of things from Bateson that resonate with the way you were, proposing your argument.
Yeah, I haven't spent as much time with Bateson as I have with Whitehead.
Yeah.
But certainly this notion that the way Bateson will just define information as a difference that makes a difference to somebody, to some organism.
Yeah.
So information isn't just free floating,
Right.
it needs to be interpreted. And, I think information theorists will try to develop a kind of view of the entire universe as just bits of information sort of running as a computer or something. And there's a way in which that can be given a Whiteheadian spin, whereby information is only information if it's interpreted from some perspective, and for Whitehead, perspective or perceptivity goes all the way down.
Yeah.
So there's informational exchange or communication going on at every level. And the human body is, as Whitehead describes it, a kind of complex amplifier of this cosmic informational flow. It channels it through our various sensory organs. And then when we become literate, further form of filtering takes place. And it could be that literacy is when the bifurcation of nature really takes hold. That sense of a separation where visual sensation and auditory sensation become folded, as the metaphor I use and there's, certainly a lot of continuities with Bateson. Mind is not just in our heads, it's an ecosystemic process.
Yeah, I want to build on that, and it's the issue of interpretation. I think this applies to all of you, but I mean particularly Corey and you, Matt. The issue of when you talk about sort of the archive of the universe, the archaeology of it, however you want to talk about adaptations, whatever. The role of interpretation in that, and the role of interpretation according to which mediation. Now you're talking in many ways, Corey, of philosophy being facilitated by print. And when we talk about, changing understandings of, say, the universe, whether it's from a medieval cosmology of finding a pattern in truth, or whether it's this more a sense of discovery, yet still falling back on trying to find a, a simplicity to it. What's that role of mediation in those changing tools? And are they, you're almost describing it as a linear progression. Are there legacies of past means of understanding that are still operative that lead to some ways a disjuncture of understanding?
Well, I would just say a couple of things. One, I don't think we've given oral noetics away. I mean, I think the way that the semi-literate are appealed to is through advertising jingles, and they usually rhyme, and they draw upon other kinds of oralistic tropes. But I think the way that I would sort of jump in would be to respond to you in terms of Glen's point, which is, I see in Heidegger, and I spent a lot of time on Heidegger many years ago, and I would say that there's repressed in Heidegger a recognition of literacy to the kind of homeless, inauthentic Dasein that he's talking about. Because I think what happened is, and this is the history, that detribalized people, modern individuals, they believe the individual comes first, they believe words are there as discrete entities, and then those individuals form collectives. Whereas in fact, it was a long historical process of detribalization that had to occur in order for them to think of themselves as potentially alienated, homeless. And I'm not sure if Heidegger's categories really work well with what we mean by the indigenous mind and the tribal mind. In some way, because for Heidegger, what happens is Heidegger wants to get rid of the individual notion. He tries to move toward Dasein of being here, being there. But then he defines Dasein as being in the world. And now once he's done that, he's caught, because if we're both being in the world, I can't differentiate myself from you. So then I need death as a principle of individuation. So death is really crucial to his notion of individuation and to his notion of authenticity. And at that point, I don't know if that works with anything in the oral world.
Okay, and I'm actually suggesting that, Matt, there, I do want to hear your thoughts on that. I'm actually suggesting that a lot of our philosophical concepts, specifically dialectics, are pre-linguistic, or at least pre-verbal linguistic, and are worked out first in the physical world. I suggest ceramics and pottery in the 9th and 8th centuries, and also collective architecture. That the issue of dialectic is clearly in the process of tensions between two-dimensionality depiction on three-dimensional surfaces. It's a long argument, I ain't going there now.
I mean, the good thing is we have multiple mediums through which to grasp, try to understand the universe.
So how much becomes imprint of that medium? And, because the archive is a raw archive, how do we make it intelligible through these diverse?
Well, we engage a plurality of media, and Whitehead's a pluralist. I like to call him an ontological pluralist. There are many worlds. When we say that the world can be conceived as a medium of communication, there are worlds, and each world is a medium of communication for each perceptive event that's apprehending it. So I don't think of cosmology in a Whiteheadian sense as a kind of totality project where we're trying to arrive at some final objective description of the world. That's not possible, ontologically speaking, from a Whiteheadian perspective. The universe itself is incomplete. We only have perspectives on it, and each medium gives us a different perspective on it.
Say hello for all.
I think Heidegger. A very provocative talk. And for me, it was a dramatization, I think, of answers to the question, what is philosophy? And whether philosophy begins with writing or ends with writing. And I think it deals with, my framework, of course, is long in this matter, the questions about whether we're living in a communication age or an information age. And in his last book, Holmes suggests that there are two forces moving our world right now, and one is interpretation or hermeneutics, and the other is digitization, and breaking things down and putting them apart, which I think goes back to the question of what is philosophy. And I'm wondering, I think you said this too, for me, I don't know that awe is really what is inspirational. I can be awed by the people on television that are singing a song, and I can be awed by Watson, the computer. But the question of love, I think, would be very important. As would be discussed by Rosenstock-Huessy or Bakhtin. Any comments about that?
Well, I don't think the way you're talking about being awed by something that's, I don't always see that as reverential. I mean, maybe there's a wonder, fear, reverential. I mean, I'm conceptualizing awe in a much deeper way than, you can say something's awesome, that was awesome, or some gradation of that, but that's not really what I was getting at. infusing things with love, and all the varieties of discussing that, I'm open to it, thinking as it needs more work to be unpacked of, some thinkers I like, Maturana and Varela, these Chilean biologists, they talk about love as acceptance of others. And again, a sense that in this pluralistic universe, and talking about being hospitable, generous with strangers, generous with the other, acceptance of the radical alterity that is the multiverse. I think love in that, and there's many other ways to think of it, is very important to projects that we're talking about here.
They both Buddhists, Maturana and Varela?
And then just Varela.
Just Varela, right?
Question back there.
Oh, yeah, no, just, Tom, good. You mentioned the word awe, and it got me thinking, because when Ronan, you were talking about awe, I think I made notes, you had a really good observation about that it involves respect and fear in front of something immense and powerful. And so awe is the beginning of wisdom, but I thought, oh, that's echoing around, and you guys are, it's a room full of textual experts here. The fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. Am I right? That's a line from Proverbs or something like that. So I thought, oh, awe, the fear of God. And then what intrigued me was the way you characterized awe, because the words that you used could effectively be reduced to the fear of God. Anyway, I just thought it was an observation.
Yeah, it could be. I'm trying to not get, because I talked with Corey about this, sometimes I think God sometimes closes down discourse in a certain way. Not that I'm particularly, I totally follow what you're saying.
I just like the idea of the
kind of
text
ways
echo.
into it, I think, avoid sometimes what can automatically, a whole other things that can become problematic, but your general train of thought, I follow.
Just the fact that it's a text, right? That's a central cultural text, and somehow it's reemerged on a slide in 2017.
And I mean, of course,
slight
Heschel was Jewish, so that
perfect.
makes sense.
Yeah, well,
and that
we
is
all
very
are,
much,
right?
Jewish insight.
Made our texts here.
Yeah.
Yeah, my question, I don't really know if I have a question, I think I do. I found all of the discussion very interesting, and I'm just trying to grasp impressions from what you've said, and there's a thread that certainly runs through all of the papers, and a couple of lines that I grasped: the world itself is a medium, the human being is an extension of media rather than the other way around, and the importance of imagination in our discussion. And then yesterday in one of the panels, the idea that Postman's idea of being calmly present in our world. And if I understood what you were saying, so on the end, was it everydayness, the present tyranny of the day? Is that what you were speaking of?
My point of everydayness, he considers everydayness discriminatory. He say everydayness, he's talking about so-called average man. For him, what he starts with a comment that initially, for the most time, most people live in that inauthentic way. And when you say presence, that's extremely important. It's a question of present. Making present or being present.
So this is my question.
Because as they, yes, I'm just returning back, as being they in public, in publicness, being, trolled, because we are at the beginning, as characteristics are being trolled into this world, and then sucked into it, and then we lose that connection, and also lose our we get detached from our selfhood in becoming, in a sense, objectified. Like it, he says, sometimes says, she talks about selfhood and itself, okay? But I see the discrepancy between there. I would call selfhood returning back to who we really are, and itself, I was kind of put the background. It would say itself, because as in daily life we become So alienated, become the product itself, okay? We also manufacture the presence. We constantly manufacture the events. This is manufactured events. I would rather be meeting someone on the street, not confined in the 5-10 minutes. That's not my way of thinking. Number one, because when that confinement, sorry, it just immediately it raises some sort of I'm not calm and present. It's enemy of the presence itself from the conscious point of view, or presence of God, let's say, or presence of cosmic power, of who we really are. The confinement immediately kills all that someone mentioned, creativity, and I cannot be confined and be creative at the same time.
Well, thank you. My question though is this. You mentioned anxiousness is perhaps a call to return, but when you think about Nicholas Carr and the glass cube, how could you not be anxious if you're inside a glass cube and being directed by media? So my question is, for the whole panel, we're not going to go back to a different age. We don't want to go back to a different age, but where in the heck are we going? And so if you guys could say, what will our world be like in 2037, 20 years out?
I have to say that there is a problem with going back, calling that tribalism. And I never said we're gonna go back to something. We
I
are.
wanted to follow on that too. Finish your thought.
Yeah, maybe I because of the way how.
In the sense of going back, that
Not quite what I
media
said.
progresses.
I wanted to clarify. When we're talking about like the primordial logos, it's not trying to essentialize that.
Yes.
It's and in a Whiteheadian perspective. Now, from Whitehead's ultimate principle is creativity, which implies this ongoing emergence and becoming. So the return there is some depth and intensity about that has some primordialness, but since it's been this ongoing creative act of unfolding novelty, there is no like one original, alpha point and no ultimate omega point. It's not trying to essentialize these terms per se, but recognizing that there are some fundamental principles, and what is to come is what we will probably be much more than we can imagine, and depends a lot on our conscience and how we respond to the call, and then some is much greater than us, and who I prognosticated in this day and age, I think, is a fool's errand.
I think if there's one common theme in McLuhan, if you look at the radio chapter and the TV chapter very carefully, he says it, the only antidote we have to the electric media is good old-fashioned print. So it doesn't have to go back to anything. We need to salvage and retain what's still here. The infrastructure is there.
Because
Yes.
we being in public, we carry the seed. Each of us is there. Presence is there, conscience is there. It's not somewhere else back in the history or maybe turning back to tribal way. The thing is that they were maybe more attuned to it, to that presence because of not the style of the life or not the They're more attuned to nature and that presence that they carry. We go there in the nature, or these people who live that. Artists go away in order to reconnect with that something, and then they start suddenly pouring light. Because they are distracted with all these formalism or whatever is going. They need to get away and get in touch with what? They don't in touch with going to the past or whatever, or something is something that you have to follow over there. No, you have to listen to yourself. We all have it, but we don't hear it.
Okay, on that note, this is a present that's part of a larger present. So we're gonna have to, no one has to leave here, but you can't stay either. So we're gonna hover around, there's a little coffee class, or we can continue the discussion.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.